All right. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So, hello. I am so glad you're here today. My name is Kelly Hitchman Craig. I work as the Director of Leadership Development and Community Engagement at the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women, which is one of the 13 general agencies of the United Methodist Church. And we're here today to talk about something that is really so important and so timely, something that I think impacts the lives of almost every single one of us, and that is trauma. And fortunately, we are so lucky to have the chance to learn from an expert in the field, Dr. Courtney Furlong. Dr. Furlong is incredibly impressive in just about every way. She holds a PhD from Auburn University. She's faculty at Huntingdon College in Montgomery, Alabama. She is a licensed counselor and has over 20 years of experience in nonprofit leadership. She is a human trafficking scholar. She has so many publications and so many prestigious awards, but she also cares really deeply about the work of the church and the ways that all of us are called to interact with our own trauma and the trauma of others faithfully. And as if that weren't enough, she is an all around amazing person and a very great friend. So, Dr. Furlong is going to lead us in an educational component this morning or this afternoon, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So if you don't mind holding your questions until the end, Dr. Furlong will answer them at that time. So without any further ado, Courtney, thank you for being here today. We are really excited to learn.
I am also so excited to be here with you. It's been a minute since I've given this presentation. And so when Kelly asked me, I was like, ooh, can I talk about trauma? Because I love trauma, which sounds so weird. But those of us who work in the field, we do really enjoy it. And so thank you, Kelly, for introducing me. I am so excited to be here with you today. One of my goals is to help inform you a little bit about trauma, how it affects our brains and bodies, so that you can serve those who have been traumatized in your communities well. But also, I want it to assist you in your own healing because it is very difficult to get through this life unscathed, and as we will find out, trauma is much more common than it is uncommon. I will say that I'm not a theologian. I will leave that up to you guys. But I am a counselor and a carer, and with a lot of experience working with some of the most traumatized individuals in the world. So when Kelly and I were talking about this, hold on, let me get my clicker to work. There we go. When Kelly and I were first talking about this, I told her that I wanted to start in Eden. And I couldn't shake this desire to start in Eden and then start with our origin story, what we were intended for. When God created us, He intended us for perfect communion with Him, perfect communion with each other, and perfect communion with the earth. We were intended for safety. When we left Eden, when there was a rupture, we lost safety, we lost trust, we lost connection, and there's deep betrayal. And pastoral care, I believe, seeks to restore glimpses of Eden in this post-Eden world that we have. Like Kelly said, I have a lot of training in mental health. I have 2 master's degrees. I have a PhD, I have a license in counseling, and I'm a certified rehabilitation counselor. And even with all of that training, I was ill prepared to deal with some of the bizarre behaviors and strange phenomena that I was witnessing in the people that I was serving. And I worked with survivors of sex trafficking probably for about 10 years. And then I was physically assaulted. And I started experiencing the very same bizarre behaviors that I was seeing in the people I was serving. I was experiencing hypervigilance and flashbacks and panic attacks and nightmares. and brain fog or trauma fog. It's kind of like mom fog for any of you who are moms, where it just seems like you can't get the thought out of your brain. I became exiled from my body. I was exiled from my identity. I was exiled from my perception of control, exiled from my community, exiled from my view that the world was just, and also exiled from my foundational belief that God was good. So when the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders first introduced post-traumatic stress disorder in 1980, they described a traumatic event as outside the range of usual human experience. But unfortunately, what we've learned since then is that trauma is far more usual than unusual. A worldwide study by the World Health Organization found that the average number of traumatic events in a person's lifetime is 3.2 traumatic events per person, and that 70% of people in the world have experienced at least one trauma in their lifetime. And oddly enough, two people can have the same experience, and one person can perceive it as traumatic, and the other person cannot or might not. And it doesn't have anything to do with someone being emotionally weak or not strong or anything like that. It just is. It's not good or bad. It just is. And so when somebody has experienced a trauma, we don't say, well, they're emotionally a weak person, and so that's why they're affected by it. It just is. We also realize that trauma is relative. So for some people, an event might be traumatic for them, whereas for others, it might not be traumatic. And often it has to do with what kind of traumatic events they've had in their past. So for some people who have experienced extreme trauma, they might not be as impacted by smaller events as someone who is not as familiar with trauma. Fortunately, within the past 10 years, really since about 2015, we've had massive breakthroughs in our understanding of how trauma affects the organic brain and body. And in partly we can thank the accessibility of brain scans, fMRIs and SMRIs. And so we're going to look at some of that in a minute. But first, I want to talk about what happens in the body when we experience stress. And stress and trauma are very much linked. So stress is a psychological and physiological response to pressure or threat. And stress in and of itself is not bad. Stress is how we get up in the morning to go to work. Stress is how I fold all my laundry that I need to do. It is the thing that keeps us moving. And when it is paired with equal amounts of rest and digest, it can be healthy. So we're flowing from stress to rest, from stress to rest, and it allows our body to go back to a place of homeostasis. And this is adaptive. So I want to talk a little bit about what happens when we're in that stress response. What is going on in our bodies? So when we identify a stressor, our hypothalamus releases corticotropin, and that's a hormone. The pituitary gland also releases adrenocorticotropin, which activates our adrenal glands. And then our adrenal glands release hormones, including adrenaline and cortisol. Our pupils dilate so that it lets in more light, so it improves our vision. Our heart rate increases to pump more blood to our muscles. Our breathing quickens to supply more oxygen to our body. Our muscles tense up, ready to act. We have heightened alertness, and we're more focused. It's almost like time starts to slow down for us. We start to sweat. Our skin might become cold and clammy. Our digestion slows down. Our adrenaline surges, and in some cases, people might experience incontinence. And that's an autonomic nervous system response to it being overwhelmed, but it also allows the body to function more efficiently. And so it really is to help the body prepare for battle, because we need this stress if we need to fight a bear. This is adaptive, meaning life-saving. So if we're being chased by a bear, we get this chemical rush throughout our body that tells us to do one of two things. We're either going to fight the bear, we're going to run away from the bear, or if our brain decides that we cannot fight and we cannot flee, we might freeze. And this is so cool because God created us to survive. This is automatic. We don't think about it. It happens in our lower brain. We're going to see that in a second. And it helps us survive. It helps us survive as a species. This is why we're still here. If this response happened in our executive brain, then we would start asking questions like, what's the bear's motivation? Well, the bear's motivation is to eat you. And so fortunately, we don't take the time to actually think about it. We just respond. And so you might have heard somebody say, I didn't even think, I just ran. Or I didn't even think, I just suddenly froze. And that's because it happens in that lower brain where we don't have cognition. But what happens if this bear, our little friendly bear here, what happens if this bear comes home every night? What happens if this bear never goes away, especially to a developing brain and a developing body? That leads to complex trauma. And I define complex trauma as trauma that occurs repeatedly and cumulatively over a period of time. It usually happens in the context of primary relationships, usually in the context of family, and it impacts several areas of the person's life, psychologically, physically, socially, and emotionally. So let's look at the brain. The fight or flight response is housed in this lower part of the brain that you see on the left-hand side of your screen. This is your survival center, and I like to think of it as our reptilian brain. This part of our brain is developed at birth. It regulates autonomic functions like breathing, digestion, heart rate, our sleep, our hunger, our instinctual behaviors, and functions that sustain life, like sex. And it's also where our flight or freeze response are. Then we have our midbrain, or our mammalian brain, our emotional center. And this develops through ages 0 to 4 years old. And this is where we start to develop memory and emotions, responses to stress, nurture, care. This is where we might experience separation anxiety, fear, rage, social bonding, and hormone control. The way I like to think about the difference in these two brains, the lower brain and the midbrain, is the lower brain is our snake brain and the middle brain is our puppy brain. And so if you ever go to a pet store and you go to the reptiles section or you see the snake, what are the snakes doing? They're sleeping, usually. They're curled up by themselves, asleep. Maybe they're eating, but usually they're sleeping. They're not social. But then you turn around and you go to the puppy section. And the puppies are playing with each other. They're super social. Even in their sleep, they're social. They just pile up on top of each other and sleep. And so from 0 to 4 years old, we're developing this puppy brain. It's not until we get to about 5 years old that our executive functions or our executive brain begins developing. And it develops in spurts from 5 to 6, 11 to 12, and then 15 through our mid-20s. And this is the area that handles logic, empathy, compassion, creativity, self-regulation and self-awareness, sequential thought, planning, problem solving, and attention. I recently heard this part of the brain described as the mother of the brain. So the one who keeps you in line and makes sure you get the things done that you need to get done. But when trauma occurs, we move out of our prefrontal cortex, we move out of that executive center, and we move back into our survival center. And like I said, it's not a decision, it happens automatically. This is how we've survived. The amygdala in particular, which is right there in the center of the brain, This is our fear response center. So the amygdala is constantly looking for things to be afraid of. And it's going, look over there, look over there, look over there. And the hippocampus works with the amygdala, and the hippocampus goes over the amygdala like this. And the hippocampus is where we hold our memories. So this is developed in our puppy brain, right? So the hippocampus is going, no, 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 we know what this is. This isn't scary. Or we do know what it is. But when this amygdala is firing constantly, especially when someone is growing up in a trauma-filled home, the hippocampus will start to shrink. And therefore, that ability to regulate that fear response goes away. And so they will remain in that fear response center and not be able to enter their prefrontal cortex and feel safe again. And this explains why a lot of people, when they're experiencing trauma, they make poor decisions. They don't necessarily understand things like cause and effect, delayed gratification, or investment in the future. And that's why it's important that when we are working with someone who is in a hypervigilant fight, flight, freeze, response, survival center space, we need to focus on number one, establishing safety. And definitely that over attempting to rationalize with them. And we'll talk more about the stages of recovery. But first, I wanted to show you some functional MRIs. This came from Bessel van der Kolk's book on Body Keeps the Score. And what he did is he put trauma survivors into the MRI machine, and he read them narratives that he had written about their traumatic experiences. And he took pictures of the brain. And what means is functional is what part of the brain is getting more blood over other parts of the brain. And so what we notice is that while they're reading that story, the right side of the brain started lighting up. And what do we know about the difference between our right side of our brain and our left side of our brain? Our left side of our brain is where we have language and math and linear thought. Our right side of our brain is where we have creativity, abstract thought. Well, if our trauma is held in the right side of the brain, this explains why it's very difficult for people to give an account of what happened to them. Instead, they say, it happened in flashes. I don't know what order it went in. I see colors and smells. And they can't say, well, on Monday at 1 o'clock, this happened, and then 5 minutes later, this happened. Because that's not how the right part of the brain works. We also notice here on the scan on the far right side, there's this area that is highlighted called the Broca's region. And you'll see here in this picture that it has gone offline. It is dark. And our Broca's region is a great way to think about it is it's our word center. This is where we have language. And so literally when a person is re-experiencing their trauma, their Broca's region shuts down, which makes the person incapable of accessing words and language. And this is why you often see people who say, I'm speechless, I don't know what to say. You have people who, when they're telling you their trauma story, their emotions aren't in alignment with what they're telling you. This very much has to do with the malfunctioning of the Broca's region. But the good thing is that as we heal, we can start to move this trauma experience over to the left side to make it feel more in control. And that's part of the healing process. Okay, so back to our bear. So if our bear is around all the time and it never goes away, and we're at that stress response constantly, that will lead to chronic stress and trauma. And trauma, broadly defined, is a distressing, life-threatening event that feels intolerable, that invokes a physiological response that does not reconcile after the event is over. And chronic stress and trauma is linked to several serious health consequences. So, and again, this happens when we stay in this place of high stress, hypervigilance, and we don't get back into homeostasis or rest and digest, or this place of peace within our bodies. So some of those health consequences that I want to point out are gastrointestinal disorders, allergies, autoimmune disorders, issues in fertility, fibromyalgia, and then some substance misuse and addictive behaviors. Mental health disorders can also be a consequence of trauma. It can be linked to mood disorders like depression, substance misuse and addiction, obsessive compulsive disorder and other anxiety related disorders, eating disorders, dissociative disorders, personality disorders, deliberate self-harm, and suicide. And of course, there are social consequences. Many people who have experienced complex post-traumatic stress disorder are incapable of forming safe, connected relationships. They tend to have problems at work or have difficulty sustaining employment. They often have financial difficulties that do coincide with the issues with employment, but it actually is separate based off of a study that I did on sexual assault survivors. Sometimes they have risky sexual behaviors. They're at greater risk of re-victimization of all types. That same study that I did showed that the more someone is victimized, the more likely they are to be re-victimized. Issues with parenting is a challenge, and then they're more likely to be incarcerated. And something that I want to point out is sometimes the problems that I've mentioned, like drug addiction and self-harm, sometimes those problems actually, when they began, were a solution. And so what I mean by that is some people use drugs and alcohol to cope with emotional distress. Self-harm is also a way to cope with emotional distress. But there's even more interesting solutions. And what's also interesting is that the people who do this, they've come up with these solutions as children. And so they have this child's brain. And I had a client who had repeatedly been sexually assaulted as a young boy. And so he decided that if he began to eat and he could overeat, that then he would become unattractive and then he wouldn't be sexually assaulted. And I just think that's so smart. Like, that's so smart for him to solve a problem that as a child was out of his control. And that this is the way he solved it. Now, the problem is that now he's an adult, his health is poor, and he doesn't need to be unattractive anymore because he's not being sexually assaulted anymore. And so if we want to address this problem that was a solution, we have to give him another solution. And that solution has to work. And that goes with addiction, it goes with all of those things. Thinking of them as solutions is really helpful. So this gets us into trauma-informed care. And you might have heard this, it's a really popular phrase nowadays, but no one's actually defined what trauma-informed care means. So I'm going to give you a definition of it. So trauma-informed care is a treatment framework that understands, recognizes, and responds to the effects of trauma, emphasizing the physical, psychological, and emotional safety for both survivors and support people, and helping survivors rebuild a sense of strength and control. So there's three primary pieces to trauma-informed care. The first one is assuming that everybody has experienced trauma. Not maybe they've experienced trauma, but that they definitely have experienced trauma. Because it doesn't hurt if they haven't experienced trauma to have trauma-informed practices. But it can harm them if they have experienced trauma, if we don't. The other thing is that we acknowledge that there's a biopsychosocial impact of trauma, meaning that it affects the whole person in their entirety, not just one area. And then the third thing is focusing on establishing safety and reestablishing safety. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about safety in a second. So before we do that, though, I'm going to talk about actions of clergy that are not trauma informed. And so I believe that it's less likely that the wonderful people who have attended today are some who have done these practices, and that is because you are here. Thank you for being here. But I do know that you will encounter people who have been told this by spiritual leaders in their lives or by people who they trusted. And so there is an act of undoing the harm that has been done that you get to do, a wonderful, amazing role that you get to play. So a couple of these things. The first thing that is not trauma informed is not believing the person. I think that is one of the greatest ways to re-traumatize somebody is to just not believe them. Another thing is minimizing or dismissing their pain. Saying things like, well, you just need to pray harder, or you need more Jesus in your life. God can't give you more than you can handle. I know you've heard some of these things before. Another thing that might happen is over spiritualizing trauma, saying things like this happened for a reason, God's testing your faith. I know these are things that you would never say, but these are things that have been said to trauma survivors time and time again. Pushing disclosure or public testimony before the time is appropriate. This needs to be a private place because when people are experiencing trauma and processing trauma, they're in a very vulnerable state. And so we don't want to violate their sense of control and safety, especially over their story. Ignoring boundaries. This is in all areas, but for example, touching the person without consent. For a lot of these people, they have been touched repeatedly without their consent. And so one small thing that you can do is say, is it okay if I put my hand on your shoulder? Is it okay if I hold your hand while we pray? Things like that. It can actually help to retrain their brain that their body does belong to them. And it can be really, really powerful. Also, if they say, I don't want to talk about that, or I don't want to go there, or I don't want to do this, saying, okay, we don't have to. Because again, that starts giving them back their perception of control over themselves and their lives. Blaming the messenger. So sometimes you might have somebody in your congregation who comes to you to tell you something that you did not want to know, and that might impact you or the functioning of the church. That is not that person's problem. That is not their fault, just because they're the ones who told you. And that goes along with centering the church and the church's needs over the needs of the individual. So encouraging someone to stay in a marriage for the sake of the marriage, to honor God. And just as a side note, if there's an abuse in the relationship, it's not a couple's problem. It's a problem with the abuser alone. And so it's important for that abuser to get treatment separately. It's not a couple's issue. It's not a marital issue. It's an issue with that one abuser. Failing to refer or collaborate with other professionals. It feels really, really good to be needed. I know. And when someone comes to you and you feel like you can help them, it really strokes our egos a lot. But let me tell you, it'll take you 1 or 2 times of getting in over your head before you're going to be like, I'm not doing that again. And so it's really, really important to have a network of people who you trust, who you can refer to. And a lot of times when you try to refer somebody out, and I'm getting into some of my things to do, trauma-informed practices, as opposed to not, but when you say, I think you need to go see someone, I want to refer you to somebody, they might feel rejected by you. That's a real thing. And also going to see a counselor that you don't know is really scary. And so it might be helpful to incorporate the person who you want to refer in a session with that individual so that they can meet that person with you. And then they can build that relationship that way. They will feel more comfortable going and seeing that person. And understanding what is the appropriate role for you, and then what's a more appropriate role for a counselor. And then focusing on fixing the situation over being comfortable being present in the place of pain with an individual is another not trauma-informed practice. I practice Judith Herman's 3 stages of trauma recovery. She proposed this in 1992, and it was transformational for the way we address trauma. And she said that trauma recovery occurs in 3 stages. The first stage is establishing safety. The second stage is remembrance and mourning. And the third stage is reconnecting. So establishing safety and reestablishing safety, think Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The difficult thing about safety is that the person has to perceive that they are safe. So it's not just that they are actually physically safe, but it's that they believe that they are safe. And oftentimes people who are familiar with unsafe situations, they will feel unsafe in safe situations. And so it takes a lot of time to actually establish safety. And oftentimes, while someone is progressing through the stages, they might have to go back and reestablish safety, and that's okay. The second stage is remembrance and mourning, and this is processing and grieving trauma. This is acknowledging what actually happened, and this is important to do because you can't forgive something that you haven't identified. So oftentimes people jump to, well, you need to forgive that person. And our survivors would be like, I forgive them, because they want to rush through that process too. They want to heal. But we have to acknowledge, we have to feel those things that we are feeling in order for us to fully know what we're forgiving. We need to mourn it, remember it, and acknowledge it. And that is a beautiful place that a pastor can help walk that person through. And then reconnecting. It's rebuilding relationships, reclaiming life, reconnecting with themselves, understanding who they are, how they're different now after what they've experienced, building a new support network, and reconnecting to the things that are important to them and that matter to them. And I love this quote from Judith Herman. Her friends call her Judy. I'm not one, but I'm a huge fan. She said, recovery can take place only within the context of relationships. It cannot occur in isolation. And a critical component of each of these stages is that it takes a lot of time. Okay, so what are some trauma-informed practices for a pastor? The first thing is embodying theology, being Christ incarnate, God with us, even in suffering, being fully present, not rushing a conversation, but being able to sit in the discomfort of that person's story. The next is conducting rituals of healing. Rituals are actually really healing for people who have experienced trauma because they know what to expect. So it establishes a sense of safety because they know what's coming, right? There's no surprises there. So some rituals of healing might be lament, anointing, communion, storytelling. Listening with curiosity instead of judgment. Believing the person as opposed to not believing what they've told you. It's not your job. You are not Olivia Benson on SVU. It is not your job to figure out if that person is telling you the truth. If that person believes that happened, then we need to engage with that person in that belief system. And so, and that's easy to do. And then you don't have to sit there going like, I don't know if they're lying or not. It's not your job to figure that out. You're not the police. Respecting autonomy and timing, letting them be the ones who say things like, it's time to leave my marriage, or I'm not ready to leave my marriage. Don't get frustrated with people who aren't ready. It's going to be their decision and their decision alone. And I guarantee you when they're ready, they're going to do it. And it's going to be like that. But they're the only ones who can make that decision. Creating emotionally safe, shame-free spaces. Offering spiritual language for healing. And this is where when we're talking about that Broca's region, language and narrative are one of the key ways to heal trauma. Being able to tell the story in a way that makes sense. It might not be technically accurate because that's the way our memories are, but that's okay. It's being able to tell a story and frame it in a way that makes sense. And clergy can help put spiritual language to that. Modeling an attuned presence and non-anxious leadership is really key. I wish I could get into attachment theory, but I cannot, I don't have time. In short, when we are born, it is critical that we attach with our primary caregiver, usually a mother, but it can also be a secondary caregiver. Um, and in that attachment, we learn to attune our emotions to that person. So when mom is calm, the infant can regulate themselves, can learn to regulate themselves. But if mom is stressed, if mom is not present, then that can lead to attachment disorders later in life. Um, Things like dismissive attachment or avoidant, or they might be clingy, something like that. Attachment is related to trauma bonding, what used to be called Stockholm syndrome. Um, and so this is what it means for us. We need to be able to learn how to find a place of peace within ourselves. And as clergy, if you can remain at peace when someone comes in a place of crisis, when they're in that loop thinking, when they can't calm down, but you stay at a place of peace, then they can attune to you. You don't attune to them, they attune to you. And it can be extremely healing. And that's just being present. Um, Providing opportunities for social connection and for group synchronization. I love group synchronization, and it has to go with attunement as well. But often people who are healing from trauma, they have a very hard time regulating their emotions. But if they can join something like a choir or a kickball team, or they can start acting, they can start to attune their emotions with the emotions of the group, and that allows them to learn how to regulate themselves. And it can also be very healing, and it can be connected to developing a skill. If they can master a skill, they can start small, like with art, but then they might learn to develop another skill where they feel confident and competent, and that gives them the confidence to continue to move forward in those scary places for them that's related to their trauma. Giving and receiving care is also really important. Trauma survivors don't want to just be taking care. They also want to be able to have opportunities to provide care. And that is, we walk out our healing, right? Isaiah 58 says, and as you do these things, you will find your healing. And so things like serving at the church, having something that they can learn to do, that they can become really good at, where they're also a part of a team. So you've got that giving and receiving care and the group synchronization and mastering a skill there at the same time. Collaborating with mental health professionals, I already said that. Honoring dignity and agency of every person. Creating things together, finding ways to provide creative outlets, because creativity is really key. When we have experienced trauma, we lose the ability to think creatively because we're in this trauma response trying to survive. And so when we encourage creativity, we allow people to start dreaming of a better future, because they can't think of a better future if they can't be creative. And if they can't think of a better future, then they can't have hope. And so it's critically important that we start to cultivate hope that life can be different. I'm trying to hurry. I was trying to figure out ways to kind of wrap this up. And this is a picture that I took at the Basilica of St. John the Baptist in Savannah, Georgia. And it was something that really stood out to me. And it says, Jesus is stripped of his garments. This is part of the Stations of the Cross. And I thought about this a lot as I was healing from my trauma, about how Jesus bore our shame, that Jesus was naked. Like, he didn't have to be naked when he was crucified, but he was. And it made me realize that Jesus is familiar with shame. Jesus is familiar with betrayal. And so Jesus is familiar with trauma. And then, of course, it goes on to say that for the joy set before him, he endured the cross and threw off its shame. You have such a privilege to reintroduce people to the personhood of Jesus. Trauma-informed ministry is resurrection work. It's eschatological. It's pointing toward Eden restored. And so I want to close before we open up for questions, is that you were made for Eden, not for exile. But even in exile, God walks with you. And I just want to thank you for your sacred work. And that's what I have. Um, this is my contact information. I'll leave that up for a second. And some recommended reading if you want to get into it. I highly recommend The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, Trauma and Recovery from Judith Herman. She's the GOAT. The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog by Bruce Perry. Um, Anything about attachment disorder with John Bowlby. And then dialectical and behavior therapy skills, or DBT skills, are very, very helpful in helping people learn how to ground themselves and become less overwhelmed when they're in a place of dysregulation. So that's what I have, Kelly. I'm going to pass it off to you now.
Thank you. Okay, well, the first question right off the bat is, do you mind giving us that definition one more time of what trauma-informed care is?
Yes. So, and she's scrolling. Um, the way I defined it is it's a treatment framework that understands, recognizes, and responds to the effects of trauma, emphasizing the biopsychosocial safety of both survivors and caregivers.
Okay, that's a good one.
And then those three pieces of it is everyone has experienced trauma. It affects all of our areas, every part of our lives, and we're focused on establishing safety.
Okay, excellent. Um, I think I have another question for you, unless someone else wants to jump in there. And if you have a question, please just unmute yourself and ask away.
Yeah, let me.
I loved what you said about your client who found himself in a pattern of overeating as a protective measure. We know that that's not actually a protective measure, and you commented on how smart like our bodies are and our minds are to try to protect ourselves. Are there any other signs that we can be looking for in persons in our community that might indicate to us that they need extra care and support?
Oh,
I know
um,
that's a hard one.
yes, D, all of the above.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, I think for people who are attuned to their community, you'll be able to see that there is stress and anxiety. If people stop showing up, for one, or if people aren't engaging in the oh yeah, I could have done that too. I could have put it in the chat.
you're good.
If people aren't engaging in the things that they used to engage with. Um, I will say a lot of the times people will not seek you out. Sometimes they will. There are a lot of people who would rather go talk to a pastor
Yeah,
than talk to a mental health professional. And I think y'all are probably very familiar with that. In our culture, it's much more acceptable to meet with your pastor and to have conversations. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, things are going very poorly. Um, but I do know that sometimes people bring issues to you that you're like, wow, this is not a part of my job description. And so in that situation, making sure you do have that network of people who you can bring in. Um, and like I said, you're here, so y'all probably are actually really good at these these things. So, but the type of people that I'm talking about.
yeah.
Um, I see a question just came in. What happens when seniors 90 plus um, experience trauma as a part of no longer being able to care for themselves? What's happening with the brain? So, anytime someone experiences depression, their risk of mental decline goes up. They're more likely to have cognitive decline much more quickly. Um, Also, processing loss, people who aren't in relate, they don't have regular relationships, especially when you start becoming 90. A lot of their friends have passed away, and so they don't have that support network that they used to have. And that is totally linked to health and happiness, contentment in life. And so it's really, really important for older people to remain in community as much as possible. I've noticed too, like when people retire, and they're not having that regular engagement where they're engaging with other people as well as like practicing thinking, like learning new things, that their cognitive decline is much faster too. Um, and so, oh, I lost. Okay, there it is. Um, and so when their body is also starting to decline, that's also going to lead to depression. And right now, the most medicated part of our population in terms of on mental health medication is elderly people. Yeah, it's really, really common for them to be on antidepressants. No.